We'll begin our forum with opening statements from the candidates in response to the following question. At the heart of Catholic social teaching is the idea of the common good. The common good is the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. In your party's view, what are the most important issues that need to be addressed for the common good of Canadians today?
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I became a Catholic as a young adult at a time when I was a student and already active in politics. And one of the things that really opened the door to my own Catholic journey was reading Centesimus Annus, the great social teaching encyclical. This text really captures the essence of good politics at the service of a common good. St. John Paul II defined that good politics as being founded on two key ideas: solidarity and subsidiarity. Solidarity is the idea that we should care about the well-being of all, not just attending to our own interests or looking out for people like us, but attending to the well-being of all, particularly the most vulnerable. Subsidiarity is the idea that decision-making and control should be left as close to the ground as possible. Better the city than the province, better the province than a national government, and also that strong individuals, families, and communities have certain natural competencies. The state should not tread on these competencies unless absolutely necessary. Solidarity works best when realized in a context of subsidiarity and of the associated commitment to human freedom. People voluntarily seeking the good of others rather than being compelled to act by the state. A state that is powerful enough to control our every action may also compel us to act in ways that are contrary to the common good. St. John Paul II wrote that the state should seek to advance the common good through both direct and indirect action, taking into consideration solidarity and subsidiarity. Quote, indirectly and according to the principle of subsidiarity by creating favorable conditions for the free exercise of economic activity, which will lead to abundant opportunities for employment and sources of wealth. Directly and according to the principles of solidarity by defending the weakest, by placing certain limits on the autonomy of the parties who determine working conditions, and by ensuring in every case the necessary minimum support for the unemployed worker. Now, if I look at politics today, I think we see some voices on the far right who want subsidiarity without solidarity. And then we have the parties of the left who advance a philosophy of solidarity without subsidiarity. To every problem or threat to the common good that they perceive, higher taxes and more federal government involvement is presented as the solution, often at the expense of human freedom. In contrast to these alternatives, the modern Conservative Party has a detailed platform, which you can find at conservative.ca/plan. It builds on the best of our record, but also contains many new ideas. It is explicitly rooted in an effort to balance and incorporate both solidarity and subsidiarity, looking out for the most vulnerable while respecting freedom, autonomy, and conscience, and advancing towards the common good. We have also seen how the big government philosophy of the left, running up more debt in the last 6 years than in the country's entire prior history, is a failure even of solidarity. It is failure to consider the costs of future debt, the burden that they will impose on future generations, and the need to secure a viable future for our children and grandchildren. I think our plan does better than the alternatives to balance subsidiarity and solidarity and to advance the common good.
Question 1 is on life and dignity of the human person. Catholics believe that at the moment we are conceived, we have been made in the image and likeness of God. It is from this likeness that all of our dignity is derived. Each of us is an incomparable, irreplaceable, unique child of God, and as such, we are each imbued with an inherent and inviolable dignity. We increase this likeness and our own dignity throughout our whole lives by seeking to grow closer to God with each moment of our being. Thus, the dignity of all human life must be respected across the entirety of a person's natural life, from conception to youth, to adulthood and professional life, through to their elderly years and the end of their life. What are your party's views on the purpose and the dignity of human life, and how do those views shape your party's platform?
Speaking on behalf of the Conservative Party, I can say that we are the only one of the major political parties in Canada which even allows its representatives to hold the views that you have just described. Our party is obviously not monolithically pro-life, and nor is it monolithically pro-choice. It does not prescribe one position on any of the major contentious moral questions, but it respects diversity of thought on them. In that sense, we are very different from the other major parties. For Liberals, New Democrats, and Greens, there is no choice but pro-choice. Liberals and New Democrats have attacked us for our efforts to defend freedom of conscience for legislators and healthcare practitioners. Our party creates a space for and defends spaces for those who have pro-life convictions against the no choice but pro-choice mentality of the other parties. We have defended conscience rights for MPs and healthcare practitioners, opposed Liberal efforts to attach a pro-choice values test to summer jobs funding, and stood up for the contribution that people of faith and conscience make in healthcare and other fields. There are also a number of critical ways that our platform advances the well-being of the most vulnerable. Our platform, available at conservative.ca/plan, commits on page 48 to the creation of a national adoption strategy, promoting adoption and reducing expenses for those participating in it. The platform also commits to expanding child benefit and starting to provide child benefit in the 7th month of pregnancy. In addition to protecting conscience, defending freedom of speech on university campuses and on the internet, and protecting the right of Catholic and other institutions to be true to their founding mission, our platform proposes significant reforms to the current euthanasia regime. Conservatives would restore the 10-day reflection period, restore the requirement for 2 fully independent witnesses, and require that anyone approving a euthanasia request receive training on how to apply the law and actually examine their patient. These things all seem fairly basic, but they are important safeguards that will protect vulnerable people from being pushed into euthanasia. We will repeal Liberal measures that allow those suffering from depression or other mental health challenges to access euthanasia. Those who are suffering from depression should be offered help and recovery, not a lethal injection. We will also require that any discussion about euthanasia only occur if the issue is raised by the patient. We have heard testimony from Canadians with disabilities having euthanasia repeatedly pushed on them, even being told that they are selfish for wanting to stay alive. This is wrong. Canadians with disabilities should be able to access healthcare without worrying about someone telling them that they are better off dead. That is why Conservatives will prevent anyone in a healthcare setting from bringing up euthanasia with a patient unless the patient raises the issue first. These safeguards were opposed by other parties in Parliament, but we believe that they are vitally necessary. The changes that we have proposed will advance the protection of life and conscience in Canada and are worthy of support.
Question 2 is on reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous peoples. In recent months, Canadians have been dismayed at reports of the large numbers of unmarked graves on the sites of former residential schools, including schools operated by Catholic institutions. These findings have been particularly traumatic for Canada's Indigenous communities and peoples, who have long lived with the intergenerational trauma of their families' experiences at these institutions. In the wake of these findings, numerous churches in Canada have been vandalized or burned, including many that are home to Indigenous Catholics. These tragedies, heaped upon tragedies, remind us that the journey of reconciliation and justice is an arduous journey that requires contrition, action, and commitment. Canadian Catholics are committed to this journey. In the words of Archbishop Donald Boland to Catholics in the Archdiocese of Regina, may this be remembered as a time when we opened our eyes and our ears, when we acknowledged the sufferings of the past and responded to them with compassion, when we turned apologies into concrete initiatives and built relationships that would build a better future. How does your party propose to advance sincere, committed, and coordinated responses by all responsible institutions to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, with the good of Indigenous people in mind, and in particular, to address the many ongoing and unconscionable crises, such as elevated rates of suicide and substance abuse, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, a lack of proper drinking water, and the chronic underfunding of reserve schools?
Residential schools were a government policy which was generally administered through religious orders and other church-affiliated entities. This was a wrong policy which denied the inherent dignity of Indigenous children, the rights of families when it comes to raising their own children, and the value and dignity of Indigenous cultures. All of those who participated in this policy, including church-affiliated groups, were wrong to do so and bear responsibility for atoning for the past and advancing reconciliation and justice in the present and future. There is increasing discussion in politics about what churches should do to advance reconciliation. I note the fact that all entities involved have apologized and that there is ongoing dialogue between Indigenous leaders in the Vatican about the role Pope Francis can play in advancing reconciliation. As a Catholic, I am watching these developments in sincere hope of progress, as I know are many Canadian Catholics and Indigenous Catholics in particular. The Vatican did not play a role in the policy of residential schools, which was a policy of the government administered by local religious entities. Indeed, residential schools were deeply contrary to the values of the Catholic Church. But I'm still hopeful that good will come from continuing dialogue between Indigenous leaders and the Pope. We should also not fail to notice the fact that when some politicians come under fire over their failure to respond to the ongoing challenges and injustices afflicting Indigenous peoples, they have often found it convenient to point the finger at churches rather than taking responsibility for their own inaction. The government has a responsibility to atone for the primary role it played and also to confront ongoing instances of injustice and inequality which fall squarely within its own areas of jurisdiction. Our conservative plan involves putting more resources into investigation and education about grave sites, creating a national memorial to honor residential school survivors and victims, recognizing safe drinking water as a fundamental human right, and ending long-term boil water advisories, and placing a major emphasis on economic development and self-determination for Indigenous communities. For too long, structures of paternalism have been reinforced without support for the fundamental changes that will give Indigenous communities the opportunity to develop, prosper, create jobs, and shape their own future. It's time for a new approach. Conservatives will start this work by creating a Canadian Indigenous Opportunities Corporation that will directly support First Nations and Inuit organizations seeking to purchase an equity stake in major projects. We will provide an initial investment of $5 billion into this corporation. We will also provide critical support for training and apprenticeships, develop an Indigenous business mentorship program, expand rural broadband access, and set targets for government procurement from Indigenous businesses. Now, finally, the preamble to this question mentions acts of vandalism that have been targeting Catholics and other faith communities this summer. These attacks have hurt Indigenous people of faith as well as others and have been widely condemned by Indigenous leaders, even while too many politicians have stayed silent. There has always been a group of anti-Catholic extremists who will seize on anything to justify their desire to discredit and destroy. This is obviously not in the spirit of reconciliation. All politicians should clearly and strongly condemn any acts of violence or vandalism, regardless of the target and regardless of the presumed justification.
Question 3 is on an economy at the service of people. In the words of Pope Francis, money is meant to serve, not rule. This statement puts simply the Catholic belief that our economy must be at the service of people, especially the most vulnerable and economically fragile among us, and not for the sake of accumulating wealth, particularly at the physical, emotional, and monetary expense of others. For many Canadians, particularly younger Canadians, a living wage and dignified work which supports a family and a dignified home are beyond reach. The result is that many are unjustly excluded from full participation in our society. What does your party propose to do to ensure that those most excluded in our economy have the opportunity to enjoy the great material prosperity of modern economic life? And how does your party propose to build an economy at the service of Canadians?
Earlier, I quoted a paragraph from Centesimus Annus by St. John Paul II, which I think well describes the role of government in creating an economy at the service of all. The state should seek to advance the common good through both direct and indirect action, taking into consideration solidarity and subsidiarity. Indirectly, and according to the principle of subsidiarity, by creating favorable conditions for the free exercise of economic activity, which will lead to abundant opportunities for employment and sources of wealth. Directly, and according to the principle of solidarity, by defending the weakest, by placing certain limits on the autonomy of the parties who determine working conditions, and by ensuring, in every case, the necessary minimum support for the unemployed worker. I believe that the modern Conservative Party is unique in understanding the balance that is required between indirect and direct state action. We need a strong economy, and wealth must be created before it can be redistributed. But we are also proposing a suite of new policy measures to stimulate the economy and protect the rights of workers. Conservatives will require large federally regulated companies to include worker representation on their boards of directors and reform federal bankruptcy laws so that in the event of corporate bankruptcy, pensioners will receive support ahead of investors. This is part of a series of pro-worker policies that seek to enhance the security and decision-making power of workers in the Canadian economy. Conservatives will double the Canada Workers Benefit and double the disability supplement. We will increase the EI sickness benefit up to 52 weeks. Now, when we think about how an economy works for all, we also have to think about those suffering injustice overseas. We see the continuing use of slave labor in other parts of the world, which increasingly makes its way into our supply chains. Products made through forced labor by Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims in China, for example, are being sold into Canada. Despite announcing a new policy on this, the Liberal government has yet to stop a single shipment. Fighting slave labor is about justice for victims and also about fairness for Canadian workers. Conservatives have committed to tough new supply chain regulation to stop the importation of products made through slave labor. Finally, one of the biggest challenges confronting many Canadians in terms of affordability is around the affordability of a home. Housing prices have gone up so dramatically as to really exacerbate inequality and put home ownership out of the hands of many Canadians. Clearly, no effective action has been taken on this in the last 6 years. To arrest this crisis in housing affordability, we will act to dramatically increase the supply of homes, making housing more affordable at lower prices to more people. Affordability is driven by supply and demand, but supply shortages have kept pushing prices up. We have a plan to build 1 million homes in the next 3 years through measures such as leveraging federal infrastructure investments to increase housing supply, releasing federal lands for housing construction, and creating new incentives for investors to build rental housing. We will also fight money laundering in the real estate sector and ban foreign investors not living in or moving to Canada from buying homes here. These and other measures, available at conservative.ca/plan, will help build an economy that works for all.
Question 4 is on care for God's creation. As Catholics, we believe that humanity's relationship with creation and the creatures of the earth is a sacred trust from God. Pope Francis has been clear that while we are meant to work with creation in serving with God as co-creators, the sinful exploitation of our natural world and resulting ecological crises like climate change threaten the existence of the human family. It seems too often that as a culture, we put our own immediate material wants before the well-being of others, including those in other parts of the world and all future generations. Living our vocation to be protectors of God's handiwork is essential to a life of virtue, says Pope Francis. It is not an optional or secondary aspect of our Christian experience. How does your political party propose to achieve an ecologically sustainable future for Canada to protect the God-given dignity of coming generations and our fellow children of God around the world?
Well, thank you. And I've particularly appreciated and learned from Pope Francis's work on this issue. I was struck by how Laudato Si', his signature encyclical on this question, highlights personal responsibility and personal sacrifice as being necessary elements of the work that is required confronting the serious environmental challenges that we face. I think many Canadians have been frustrated to see leaders preach one set of principles on the environment and then fail to practice them. Now, Conservatives have a strong and effective environmental plan, which independent experts have said achieves the same greenhouse gas emissions reductions as other plans. I think our plan also does a better job of integrating concerns for both the environment and for building an economy that works for all. Our full plan is available online, but I wanted to use this opportunity to highlight 3 distinctions between our plan and the government plan. They are border adjustments, carbon savings accounts, and tackling unsafe plastic disposal. So border adjustments. The Liberal approach to climate change has imposed costs and regulatory requirements on Canadian companies, but failed to put the same requirements on foreign companies that sell their products into the Canadian market. This doesn't make any sense. Why allow Chinese companies, for example, to sell products to Canada which have lower environmental standards in production without some kind of added price to offset the advantage that they enjoy over Canadian producers as a result? Conservatives recognize that climate change is a global problem, and that pushing companies to operate outside our border hurts our economy without helping the environment. So the Conservative plan commits to introducing costs for foreign companies at the point of importation of products to Canada that align with the costs that are imposed on Canadian industry. This will reduce greenhouse gas emissions and also reduce the incentive for companies to move their operations overseas. Carbon savings accounts. One of the biggest challenges for individuals seeking to reduce their environmental footprint is the cost of adaptation. Making it more expensive to heat your home doesn't do any good if you can't actually afford the retrofit that would allow you to reduce energy consumption. The Conservative plan proposes to give all of the money collected through a point of sale carbon price back to individuals who pay it in order to use for adaptation. Our plan achieves the same greenhouse gas emissions reductions even while lowering gas prices because it actually gives individuals the resources they need to fund adaptation. And tackling unsafe plastic disposal. How do we confront the serious challenge of ocean plastic pollution? Since most ocean plastic waste comes from a small number of developing countries, we can best tackle plastic waste by prohibiting its export and promoting plastic recycling and reuse, and by working with developing countries to apply new repurposing technology. In the last Parliament, Conservatives started this process by putting forward a private member's bill prohibiting the export of plastic waste. However, the bill was opposed by the governing Liberals. While talking about limiting single-use plastics, Liberals are still in favor of permitting the export of plastic waste to countries which are not well positioned to recycle it. So this has to change as well.
Question 5 is on rights, responsibilities, and participation in society. Catholic social teaching recognizes a wide range of rights inherently owed to every person in respect of their dignity as a child of God. The Church also teaches that human rights are indissolubly linked to human duties. In this way, working towards the common good of all is a responsibility for each and every one of us and every institution in Canadian society. In that spirit, how does your party propose to encourage and enable the great breadth of civil society in Canada to employ their time, talents, and treasure in the service of the common good and in full partnership with governments, business corporations, and cultural institutions in order to promote the full participation of every Canadian in our society?
There is a vital need for concerted action across different social institutions to revivify community ties, and government has an important role to play in that work. At one time, of course, most healthcare, education, and other mechanisms of support were provided by faith-based and other private organizations. Government got involved in understandable hope of ensuring universal access and universal provision. But governments involved in these areas could have done a better job of fostering partnership with existing institutions. Partnerships between the public sector and the private not-for-profit sector leverage both the public commitment to universal access and the ability of private organizations to leverage the voluntary involvement and goodwill of everyday citizens. These partnerships also facilitate innovation. Government bureaucracies tend towards uniformity, while private not-for-profit organizations can offer personalized and innovative approaches. Still today, many churches and other not-for-profit organizations are interested in partnering with government on healthcare, on combating the opioid crisis, on creating opportunities for the most vulnerable, on housing, and on many other issues. But there are two things that are holding back the possibility of greater partnership in these areas. One is red tape, and the other is a lack of respect for the consciences and values of those involved in this private work. On the red tape issue, I'd like to share the example of private refugee sponsorship. Catholic and other organizations partner with the government through private refugee sponsorship, with the government reviewing and approving applications and private organizations identifying and supporting refugees for their first year. Data shows that privately sponsored refugees do much better than publicly sponsored refugees because they come into existing communities of love and support. This is a clear case example of the benefits associated with partnership between private not-for-profit actors and public institutions. But in recent years, many private refugee sponsors have raised concerns about the layering on of new additional red tape, as well as the arbitrary capping of the number of privately sponsored refugees that can come in. This policy of adding needless administrative burdens on community groups is something that we will end. Bureaucracies naturally tend towards expansion, but we need leaders who understand the importance of keeping bureaucracies in check. Now, the other challenge confronting organizations who want to partner with government is a lack of respect for their conscience and values. The Liberal government recently tried to bring in a values test for the Canada Summer Jobs Program, requiring any organization receiving funding from the government to check a box indicating their agreement with particular positions of the Liberal Party that actually had nothing to do with the jobs involved. These kinds of values tests are part of a larger problem. Many organizations are interested in cooperating with the government on the delivery of social services, but will not do so at the expense of their values. Another example, we need to see the expansion of hospice and palliative care in this country, but that isn't going to happen if we don't respect the conscience and values of those who work in this area.
Question 6 is on solidarity. Solidarity is acceptance of the truth that because all people are part of the same human family, part of the one body of Christ, what happens to others affects us as well, regardless of differences in location or life circumstances. Solidarity is found in a commitment to the good of one's neighbor. The good of one is the good of all, and the other is as important as the self. Injustice done to another is an injustice that affects everyone, and Catholics stand in solidarity with the unique injustices and sufferings facing so many Canadians, whether our Indigenous communities, our poorest neighbors, immigrants and refugees escaping persecution abroad, those living in isolated communities, those living with the ongoing mental health and addictions consequences of the pandemic, and the young, including young families, and the extraordinary challenges to human dignity they all face. How does your party plan to concretely express solidarity in partnership with other social, economic, and cultural institutions with Canada's most vulnerable people?
In addition to taking indirect action, such as establishing the conditions for employment and opportunity and expanding partnerships with faith-based and other not-for-profit organizations, direct action is required by government. Our platform, available at conservative.ca/plan, offers strong and serious proposals for direct government action aimed at helping the most vulnerable. Particularly vulnerable groups of Canadians include those facing homelessness and addictions. Conservatives will re-implement the housing first approach to homelessness, make recovery the overarching goal of substance abuse policy, and create 1,000 new residential drug treatment beds and 50 new recovery community centers. By emphasizing and investing in recovery, Conservatives will seek to end the opioid crisis instead of just managing it. Our platform puts a major emphasis on mental health. During this pandemic, there has been an increase in the number of people struggling with mental health challenges, and yet the government chose this, the absolute worst time, to pass a law allowing those facing mental health challenges to actually receive suicide facilitation from the medical system. Those struggling from depression and other mental health challenges should be offered support for recovery, not suicide facilitation. Conservatives will reverse this Liberal law and bring in other proactive measures to assist those suffering from mental health challenges. Our Canada Mental Health Action Plan will seek partnership with the provinces to provide stable, predictable funding to allow an additional 1 million Canadians to receive mental health treatment every year. We will encourage employers to add mental health coverage to their employee benefits plans by offering a tax credit for 25% of the cost of additional mental health coverage for the first 3 years. We will also provide support to charities and not-for-profit organizations working in mental health and create a national 3-digit suicide prevention hotline. For Canadians living with disabilities, we will double disability support in the Canada Workers Benefit, boost funding for accessibility, and make it easier to qualify for the disability tax credit and registered disability savings plan. Finally, I'd like to share a little bit about our plan to help those most vulnerable who are living beyond our borders. The Conservative International Development Policy commits to maintaining existing levels of international development, but also brings in proactive reforms to actually deliver more assistance to the most vulnerable. One way that we will do this is by reforming onerous direction and control regulations. These regulations require development projects overseas to be directly controlled by Canadian organizations if the Canadian funding partner is to maintain its charitable status. These rules are outdated, promote colonial approaches to development which deny community-based control, and impose additional requirements in terms of red tape. Reforming these regulations would unlock millions of new dollars to help the most vulnerable. Conservatives will also reopen Canada's Office of Religious Freedom, started under the last Conservative government, but closed by the Liberals. This office will help Canada re-engage with supporting the most vulnerable victims of persecution around the world.
Question 7 is on Canadian culture. The importance of local, regional, and national cultures cannot be overemphasized as means of balancing our senses of solidarity with desires for freedom of self-expression. Pope Francis has recently noted that while we are called to welcome the presence and positive influence among us of people from other cultures, the solution to our own local cultural problems is not to spurn the richness of our own cultures. Pope Francis writes, just as there can be no dialogue with other without a sense of our own identity, so there can be no openness between peoples except on the basis of love for one's own land, one's own people, one's own cultural roots. I cannot truly encounter another unless I stand on firm foundations, for it is on the basis of these that I can accept the gift the other brings, and in turn offer an authentic gift of my own. I can welcome others who are different and value the unique contribution they have to make, only if I am firmly rooted in my own people and culture. What do Canadian culture and identity mean to your party? Are all relevant voices in Canada invited to participate in shaping Canadian culture? And if not, how would your party propose to address the building of Canadian identity in conjunction with other governments and with other social, cultural, and economic institutions?
The love of the universal is indeed grounded in the love of the particular. We have an obligation to love and serve those in our immediate surroundings, and that is the basis on which a love for all humanity is built. Since the beginning, Canada's culture has been defined by an embrace of religious, ethnic, and linguistic diversity. We were founded through a pact predominantly between English-speaking Protestants and French-speaking Catholics. And this embrace of diversity has expanded to include greater recognition of Indigenous peoples who were already here and the welcoming of new communities from other ethnic, religious, and linguistic backgrounds. Of course, diversity in itself is not enough. There are many very diverse countries which are characterized by conflicts between different groups. What has made Canada work well is a long-standing commitment to peaceful pluralism, to the idea that people with a range of different experiences and perspectives can fully live out their identities while also coming together in one nation characterized by common political values. Further, we have contended that this diversity, facilitated by peaceful pluralism, allows us to do better together by drawing from the ideas and experiences of different peoples, different cultures, and different traditions. Our diversity also strengthens our ability to engage in the world, because our own domestic diversity facilitates connections with a broader range of peoples and nations. This is the dream of a strong multicultural Canada, founded on a commitment to peaceful pluralism and to freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, facilitating the kind of personal and national growth that happens when we can draw on the full range of human knowledge and experience. There are also threats to this reality. Escalating instances of violent extremism, including violence targeting individuals and groups on the basis of their identity, are fraying national harmony. Doctrines of collective guilt, which seek to blame whole groups of people for the actions of some of their members, inevitably create division. A refusal to dialogue with others and efforts to limit freedom of speech, such as the Internet Censorship Bill C-10, undermine the functioning of a healthy democratic pluralism. To build a healthy Canadian identity, governments should forcefully condemn all instances of violence, should clearly criminalize incitement to violence, and should defend the rights of all to participate in the public square. As we reflect on our culture, it is important to remember the lessons of the past and learn from them, while recognizing how the efforts of our ancestors established the ground on which this great country has been built. Conservatives will create a new Canadian Heritage Preservation Fund to repair and restore historical monuments, statues, and heritage buildings. There is such a thing as common Canadian values, and those are political values rooted in how our politics and our public square should function. We resolve our disagreements through dialogue. We protect the rights of others to have different opinions, and we defend the ability of all to participate in that shared conversation, regardless of their background or starting points.
We're closing our forum now with closing statements from the candidates on the following question. What is most attractive for Catholics in voting for your party in this election?
Well, thank you again for the opportunity to participate in this important forum. Conversations like this reflect the value of people of faith engaging in dialogue with political leaders. I believe the church and state should be structurally separate, but they are also often working towards similar goals. Catholics should become engaged with the Conservative Party for three reasons. First, as I have sought to argue, the modern Conservative Party's commitment to integrating both solidarity and subsidiarity is more aligned with Catholic social teaching than the approach of any other party. Our approach to solidarity includes strong new policies to defend human rights beyond our borders and a commitment to looking out for the most vulnerable here at home. We are also seized with the importance of solidarity with the next generation. How we manage our public finances and the effectiveness of our environmental policies will shape the kind of country we pass on to the next generation. Solidarity with those who we can see and with those who we cannot see. Solidarity with those who have been born and with those who have yet to be born. And also subsidiarity. Our approach to politics recognizes the value of strong families and communities as the cornerstone of a good society. We recognize that freedom is the basis for reflection, dialogue, and national growth. And we seek partnerships between government and civil society that advance the common good, facilitated through the removal of red tape and the protection of conscience. Our commitment to the integration of solidarity and subsidiarity is the first reason why the Conservative Party should be the preferred choice of Catholics. Secondly, the Conservative Party is the only major party within which a Catholic who is fully committed to the teachings of the Church is able to fully participate. If you're a Catholic who believes in the inherent dignity of life at all stages, who wants to fight homelessness, protect the environment, support international development, and increase supports for those with disabilities, you are welcome in the Conservative Party. However, if you wish to run as a candidate for any other party with those same set of values, then you would be disqualified from running on the basis of your convictions about life. Now, thirdly, Conservatives are the only party that is seeking a constructive relationship with the Catholic community. We are the only party to speak out consistently against violence and vandalism targeting the Catholic community, and defend the ability of Catholic entities to partner with government while maintaining their values. We have sought constructive engagement to advance shared goals on reconciliation, rather than pointing fingers to avoid taking responsibility. We have seen escalating anti-Catholic rhetoric coming from the other major parties. We have spoken out against that as well. Catholics in Canada have done so much to strengthen our country. Canada needs your prayers and your active involvement in the political process now more than ever. Thank you, and God bless.